The writer of the Dhammapada says that though you might conquer in battle 1,000 times 1,000 men, you're the greatest battle winner if you conquer just one yourself, right? And so the writer is getting at the challenge of self-mastery, the challenge of self-control. The idea is that human beings, there's something in us that's self-destructive. There's something in us that's self-defeating. There's something in us that's self-deceptive. And getting control over that is difficult. We see this in Aristotle's Ethics. Aristotle wrote that probably we should believe that the soul contains an irrational element which is opposed and runs counter to reason. And so the writer of the Dhammapada, recognizes that self-control is a very tough thing. And Aristotle kind of gives labels to these elements within us that are at war. As he sees it, there's an irrational element within us that causes us to do things that are not in our own interest, that causes us to do things that are not in the interest of others, that cause us to do things that are not in the interest of our society, things we look back and wonder like, wow, why in the world did I do that? Or we observe another person doing something, we say, how could that person possibly think that, that this is a good idea? There's something irrational at work within us, but then there's also something rational at work within us. And Aristotle sort of describes a human being in a state of conflict, right? And it's a serious conflict. It's a difficult one, and this is why the writer of the Dhammapada says that, for a person to really gain mastery over the self, that's a significant victory, right? Here's the writer of the Imitation of Christ, Thomas à Kempis. We do not all have the same things to overcome, but we all have strong passions to subdue. There's that language of struggle. Passions within us that have to be subdued. Passions within us that have to be tamed. Passions within us that have to be put down. Notice this language, the war against our vices. Well, who's waging war against our vices? Well, other people can, by correcting us, by disciplining us when we're children, by punishing us if we break the law. But I think Thomas à Kempis is really talking about sort of an internal war, a moral, spiritual, psychological war. A war against our vices and passions is harder than any physical work. Notice how similar that is in spirit to what the writer of the Dhammapada says, that if you conquer 1,000 times 1,000 men, well, that's one thing, but if you conquer yourself, that's really a significant victory, right? The war against our vices and passions is harder than any physical work. Self-mastery, self-control. This is tough. To use Aristotle's language, the irrational is at war with the rational, right? And we want the rational to win out, right? But it's not always easy. In fact, sometimes it's quite difficult. We have St. Paul in his letter to the church at Rome in the first century, sort of describing himself in the state of conflict. I don't understand what I do. What I want to do, I don't do, but what I hate, I do, right? And I think most of us can identify with this. We're on the way to do something, and part of us is saying, don't do it. But there's another part of us saying, do it. And then we look back and say, why did I do it? We're about to say something, and part of us is saying, yeah, go ahead and say it. And part of us is saying, don't say it. And we say it, and we look back and wonder, why did I say that? Now, of course, what we want is to be able to look back and say, oh, no, I made the right decision. I was thinking of saying that stupid, destructive thing, right? But fortunately, I didn't. Oh, I'm so glad I didn't say that. I was getting ready to do that thing that would have caused myself harm, would have caused someone else harm. I'm so glad I did not do that. That's where we want to be, but there's a struggle. Julian of Norwich, this brilliant young woman in England, 14th century, 1300s. She's writing in her Revelations of Divine Love, and she describes something similar. She says that within human beings there's an animal will which can have no good impulses, right? But there's also within us a godly will which can have no bad impulses. And so we almost have two creatures living in one body. It's similar, Aristotle and Julian probably don't mean the same thing, but they're describing something similar. There's an internal struggle. We see Paul describing this internal struggle. We see the writer of the Dhammapada recognizing the fact of this internal struggle. Sigmund Freud, his theory of mind, we won't say a lot about it, but just to make the basic point, that Freud's conception of the mind has people at war within themselves. Part of the mind he calls the id, the it in Latin, right? The id. And the id is full of wicked, impulsive, beastly, violent, destructive tendencies, right? That's one part of the human psyche. Another part of the human psyche is the superego, and that's kind of the angel. If the id is the wicked angel on the one shoulder, the superego is the good angel on the other shoulder. And these two things are kind of at war. The superego is saying, oh, you should be kind, you should be civil, you should be caring, you should be trusting, you should be trustworthy, etc. The id is saying, no, you should be selfish, you should be self-centered, take what you need. And it's got these violent, beastly tendencies. And according to Freud's theory, the ego is stuck in between the id and the superego, trying to figure out how to channel the energies of the id in a non-destructive way. The basic point for us being that we have the Dhammapada, we have Aristotle, we have Thomas à Kempis, we have St. Paul, we have Julian of Norwich, we have Sigmund Freud, all in one way or another getting at the same theme, that is that human beings are creatures at war within themselves. And Aristotle writes about this a little bit. Aristotle writes about how it's difficult for people to be good. And by good, we just simply mean decent human beings, right? Human beings who are making moral decisions, who are carrying on with their lives every day and pretty much getting it right. And some of the things that happen, Aristotle says, cause us anger. And there are things that people should get angry about. I mean, there are things that are worth getting angry about. St. Paul says, be angry and sin not. In other words, yeah, there are things that should cause us to be angry, but just make sure you don't sin in the process of being angry. In other words, be angry in the right way. That's what St. Paul suggests. Aristotle says something similar. He says that, there are things that we should be angry about, right? But we want to be angry in the right way. So, for example, he says it's difficult business to be good. It is easy to get angry. Anybody can get angry, right? But to feel or act towards the right person, to the right extent, at the right time, for the right reason, in the right way, that is not easy. So let's say something happens and I get angry. Well, to use Aristotle's language, that irrational part of me might act on impulse, might strike out, might say something destructive. And in the process, everybody's worse off. To use Julian's language, that beastly will within, when I'm made angry about something, again, I might want to lash out. Freud, his conception of the id, I get angry and the id responds and I want to lash out, I want to hit back, I want to tear that person down, either physically or with my words. I want to step on that person in some way, literally or in some different way. No, but the ideal is if there's something to be angry about, then we want to be angry for the right reason, to the right level of intensity, be angry with the right person, for the right length of time. It's not easy to get anger right. Just like, it's not easy to get a lot of things in daily life right when it comes to interactions and wondering about how we should carry on with our lives. And one of the things that makes it so difficult is that there's this continuous internal struggle. I feel like my ego has been bruised and so I want to hit back, right? But I should be careful in how I respond. One of the reasons it's hard to be good, to use Aristotle's language, one of the reasons it's hard to act on the godly will, to use Julian's language, one of the reasons it's hard to be rational, to let the rational mind direct me, to use another of Aristotle's terms, is that these other elements are pulling me in a different direction. The irrational, the beastly, the id, pulling me in these other directions. There's this internal fight, and Paul describes it beautifully in Romans chapter 7. The things I don't want to do, I do. The things I want to do, I don't do. Wretched man that I am, Paul says. So we look at this passage again. So Paul describes himself, and then he says, "Oh, so who's going to rescue me?" I mean, the implication being I can't rescue myself, right? And so he says, "Well, thanks be to God who delivers me through Jesus Christ our Lord." That Paul's idea is that Christ offers us grace, Christ offers us forgiveness, Christ offers us moral teaching, and we accept all of these things, okay? But you could read that passage and think, well, it's a purely passive thing. Oh, okay, so I'm in this state of moral conflict, and then I say, Christ rescue me, and that's it. It could be a passive thing. But of course Paul doesn't mean that at all. Because within the letter to the Romans itself, Paul talks about the moral work that people need to do. So Paul clearly isn't saying that we can just sort of passively sit there and expect, something outside ourselves to end this struggle, right? And we know this because throughout Paul's letters, he gives us advice and he gives us, words of counsel about how we should live. And we look at this passage here from Philippians chapter 4, Paul's letter to the Philippians chapter 4. And I think it's my favorite verse in the New Testament because Paul gives us really good advice on the kinds of things we should think about. Now, the only reason Paul would give this kind of advice is because it's not always easy to think about the kinds of things he says we should think about. There's this beastly element, there's this irrational element, there's this id, there's this struggle within us that's pulling us away from what's good for us. And so Paul has to remind us, Paul feels compelled to remind us of the kinds of things we should focus on. And this might take some work. Things that are true. Well, we might be attracted to things that are false. No. Pull our mind back. Let's focus on things that are true. Let's focus on things that are noble. It's interesting to look at the destructive things. It's interesting to watch destructive things. There's a certain attraction in that. But let's bring our minds to things that are noble. Let's bring our minds to things that are right. Let's bring our mind to things that are pure. Let's bring our mind to things that are lovely. Let's bring our mind to things that are admirable. Let's bring our mind to things that are excellent and praiseworthy. And underpinning this is an assumption of some kind of work. Paul is saying, look, think about this kind of stuff. If thinking about this kind of stuff came naturally to everyone, Paul wouldn't have to say it. There is the beastly thing within us. There is the id, right? There is that irrational element within us that pulls us away and directs our minds, directs our souls to the opposite, to things that are ignoble, to things that are demeaning, to things that are degrading, to things that are to things that diminish the overall quality of life. And we recognize, these things diminish the overall quality of life, and yet for some reason we're attracted to them. We want to give them time. We want to give them attention. Paul's saying, no. If we want to have better lives, if we want to have better communities, if we want to have better families, then these are the kinds of things we should work at, right? It's always going to be a struggle. But the idea is, as we proceed, as we continue in this fight, this internal fight, the hope is that over time, that beastly element has less power. That over time, that irrational element has less power. That over time, that id has less power as we practice, as we practice, as we practice, as we stay in the fight of being, as Aristotle says, good people, that is, decent people, people of integrity, people of honor, people who are trustworthy, etc. This is a good way to live, but it takes work to get there.